Who really pays the ultimate price when the global chessboard of trade goes to war? It's a question that completely dominates the headlines, but the actual mathematical reality behind it, it's almost always misunderstood. Think about the grittiest parts of international negotiations. Like when Britain negotiated its Brexit withdrawal from the European Union, the stakes were incredibly high. Why? Because facing new tariffs and non-tariff barriers outside the EU's customs union could add anywhere between 2 and 15% to the cost of their exports. And honestly, that is a massive economic shockwave.
So welcome to this explainer. Today we're going to explore the fascinating and honestly sometimes ruthless world of international trade policy. I want you to think of global trade not just as shipping containers moving across oceans, but as this high-stakes cinematic game of chess. Governments literally have an entire arsenal of economic weapons at their disposal. We're talking taxes, subsidies, legal limits, all designed to protect their own pieces on the board. But as we're about to see, every single move has a countermove, and the collateral damage is often pretty surprising.
Here's our game plan for today. First, the mechanics of tariffs. Second, calculating winners and losers. Third, subsidies, quotas, and restraints. Fourth, real-world trade battles. And finally, the ultimate trade scorecard.
All right, Section 1, the mechanics of tariffs.
Let's start with tariffs. They are the oldest, most fundamental weapon of trade policy out there, traditionally used to drum up government revenue and shield domestic sectors from foreign competition. Now, we typically see them in two main flavors. On the left, we've got specific tariffs. These act as a fixed charge for every single unit imported. Think of it like a flat fee, say $3 per barrel of oil. Easy enough, right? Then, on the right, we have ad valorem tariffs. These are levied as a fraction of the imported goods value, kind of like a 25% tax on imported trucks. But here's the absolute crucial takeaway. Regardless of which type a government uses, they both effectively act as a cost of transportation. They drive a wedge between domestic and foreign prices, artificially jacking up the price in the importing country and dropping it in the exporting country.
Moving on to Section 2, calculating winners and losers. So, we know tariffs change prices, but how do we measure the exact impact on society? Well, to mathematically derive who wins and who loses, we have to lock down two crucial microeconomic metrics. First up, consumer surplus. This basically measures the amount you, the consumer, gain from a purchase. It's the difference between the price you actually pay and the absolute maximum you are willing to pay. It's like if you're willing to pay $10 for a premium coffee, but you find out it only costs $4, that sweet $6 difference is your consumer surplus. Now, producer surplus is the exact opposite. It's the difference between the actual selling price and the lowest price the producer was willing to accept. If a farmer is happy to sell a bushel of apples for $10, but the market price is $15, boom, they gain a $5 producer surplus. These two metrics are exactly what we need to calculate the overall social gains and losses of international trade.
Okay, let's actually derive the net welfare effect here. Step 1, we take the total consumer loss caused by those higher tariff prices. From that massive loss, we mathematically subtract the gains made by domestic producers. Then, we subtract the new tax revenue collected by the government. So what are we left with? Mathematically, this leaves us with two triangles of pure economic waste. That's efficiency lost because consumers are forced to buy less, and domestic producers inefficiently produce more to fill the gap. It also leaves a rectangle representing the terms of trade gain. But, and this is a huge but, that terms of trade rectangle only exists if a country is large enough to force foreign exporters to lower their prices to stay competitive. If you're a small country, you can't influence world prices. So that rectangle, it disappears entirely, and you're left with absolutely nothing but those two triangles of pure efficiency loss.
Let's look at how wild these calculations can get in the real world. Imagine an automobile sells globally for $8,000. The parts to build that car cost $6,000. That leaves a workable margin of $2,000 for anyone assembling it. Now, suppose a developing nation decides, hey, we want our own auto assembly industry, so they slap a 25% tariff on imported fully assembled autos. Domestic assemblers can now charge $10,000 for a car. Suddenly, their workable margin just jumped from $2,000 to $4,000. Because that margin literally doubled, a simple 25% tariff mathematically creates an effective rate of protection of 100% for that domestic assembly industry.
But let's flip that around. Suppose a country already assembles cars but decides it wants to protect its domestic parts manufacturers instead, so they place a 10% tariff on those $6,000 imported parts. The cost of those parts suddenly spikes to $6,600. The domestic auto assembler, whose final car price is still fixed by the world market at $8,000, just saw their workable margin shrink from $2,000 down to just $1,400. By making a move to protect one industry, the government mathematically generates a counterintuitive negative 30% effective protection rate for their domestic car assemblers. They've actually kneecapped their own final producers.
Let's keep building on this. Section 3. Subsidies, quotas, and restraints.
Tariffs are far from the only pieces on the global chessboard. In the modern world, most government intervention takes other, kind of more covert forms. Take export subsidies. Back in 2013, the sheer scale of the European Union's Common Agricultural Policy, the CAP, led to massive protests, like you see here. It was originally designed to guarantee high prices for European farmers, but the support prices were set so high that Europe ended up producing way more food than it could ever consume. To avoid just sitting on infinite mountains of butter and wheat, the EU turned to a massive export subsidy program to dump the surplus on the world market. This single policy cost European taxpayers a staggering 59 billion euros in 2013 alone, and that's not even counting the indirect cost to everyday food consumers. An export subsidy unambiguously leads to costs that far exceed its benefits, hurting domestic consumers and draining the government budget, all while artificially enriching producers.
Now, how do tariffs compare to import quotas or voluntary export restraints, also known as VERs? Well, an import quota is just a direct restriction on the quantity of a good that can be imported. A VER is essentially the exact same thing, but it's imposed from the exporting country's side, usually to avoid getting hit with worse trade restrictions. Both of these policies raise domestic prices just like a tariff does. But here is the absolutely crucial mathematical difference. A tariff generates direct tax revenue for the government. With quotas and VERs, the government gets nothing. Instead, that extra money, which economists call quota rents, is collected by whoever happens to hold the import licenses. Or, in the case of a VER, it's captured directly by foreign governments and foreign firms.
Let's look at some real-world case studies to see exactly how this plays out. Section 4. Real-world trade battles. Let's set the scene with the epic 2013 European Union-China solar panel dispute. China had rapidly become the world's largest producer of solar panels, and they were exporting heavily into the EU. European producers launched a formal complaint. They accused Chinese exporters of being heavily subsidized by their government and basically flooding the EU market at prices way below the actual cost of production. This was no small spat. We're talking about a massive conflict involving 21 billion euros worth of imports every single year.
Notice on the chart how quickly this escalated. The EU designed a swift, incredibly high-stakes retaliation to protect their domestic sector. They slapped a provisional tariff of 11.8% on Chinese panels in June 2013, with a very clear threat. This rate is going to skyrocket to an average of 47.6% within just 2 months.
But remember, every move on the chessboard has a countermove. China maneuvered to retaliate immediately. They launched anti-dumping and anti-subsidy probes into imports of European wine, which heavily threatened countries like France, Italy, and Spain. They even threatened probes into the EU luxury car industry. This perfectly proves the painful reality of trade wars. Retaliation almost always targets entirely unrelated industries. It threatens to reduce global trade volume and leaves both economies worse off. Ultimately, they settled the dispute by having China agree to limit export volumes and abide by a price floor, which is essentially a voluntary export restraint. And the main losers in all of this? European consumers, who ended up paying substantially more for their solar power.
Speaking of voluntary export restraints, we have to break down the famous 1980s US-Japan auto dispute. Back then, US consumer demand dramatically shifted to smaller, fuel-efficient cars because of oil price shocks, and Japanese market share absolutely soared. To protect U.S. auto manufacturers without officially kicking off a trade war, the U.S. government effectively asked Japan to just voluntarily limit its own exports. Japan agreed, capping exports at 1.68 million autos initially. The result? The price of Japanese cars in the U.S. rose significantly, and that lucrative quota rent we talked about earlier was captured entirely by Japanese firms. It's estimated that this single policy cost the United States $3.2 billion by 1984. It was primarily just a massive, direct transfer of wealth straight to Japan.
All right, Section 5, the ultimate trade scorecard. Let's pull all of this together.
When we synthesize all this data into a single matrix, a pretty stark mathematical reality emerges. Look at the column for consumer surplus. Under a tariff, an export subsidy, an import quota, or a voluntary export restraint, consumer surplus falls every single time. Every single policy hurts the consumer. Now, while domestic producer surplus does increase in every scenario, meaning yes, domestic firms benefit, The broader story is really troubling. When you look at overall national welfare, export subsidies and VERs unambiguously cause it to fall. Tariffs and import quotas only ever have a chance of not hurting overall national welfare if the country is large enough to manipulate world prices. And even then, the outcome is totally ambiguous.
Which brings us to a final, provocative thought to leave you with today. We've seen the math. We've logically walked through the real-world data together, and the numbers clearly show that trade protection almost always generates pure economic waste while penalizing the everyday consumer. So, the very next time you see headlines about a new tariff or a trade war brewing on the global chessboard, ask yourself, are those concentrated political benefits given to a few domestic producers truly worth the mathematical efficiency losses forced upon the rest of society? Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep thinking critically about the moves being played out there.